Something happened on a narrow strip of sand on the Black Sea coast, and most people missed it. Russian forces have started pulling back from the Kinburn Spit. That sentence sounds like a minor frontline update. It's not. The unit that held this position wasn't some conscript battalion scrambling around in the mud. This was the 337th Airborne Regiment, a dedicated special formation that had spent 3 full years building and maintaining its grip on this particular stretch of coastline. They didn't lose it in a battle. They didn't get pushed out by a Ukrainian ground assault. They left because they ran out of food. That detail should stop you for a second, because if an elite Russian airborne unit is abandoning a 3-year position because no one could get them supplies, that isn't a story about the Kinburn Spit. That's a story about what Ukraine has quietly figured out how to do, and what it means for every other position Russia is trying to hold south of the Dnipro. Let's go back to the beginning, because the geography here matters more than most reporting suggests. The Kinburn Spit is roughly 10 kilometers of sand jutting out where the Dnipro estuary opens into the Black Sea. It looks unremarkable on a map, just a thin line between water and more water. But every fleet that ever contested the Black Sea treated this place as a primary objective. Whoever holds the Spit controls the approach to Mykolaiv port. And Mykolaiv port, at full capacity, handles close to a third of Ukraine's agricultural exports. That port has been functionally closed for years. The direct artillery threat from Russian positions on Kinburn was a large part of why. So this isn't a remote outpost. It's a stopper in a bottle. Russia understood that. That's why they assigned the 337th Regiment there at the end of 2023 and told them to stay. And that's where the first problem began. Not for Ukraine, but for Russia. The 337th Regiment was good at what they were built to do. They were not built to occupy a sandbar. The physical reality of the Kinburn Spit makes conventional defensive fortification close to impossible. The water table runs so high that any trench you dig fills with water almost immediately. There's no hard ground to build bunkers into. The regiment was essentially told to hold an exposed position on a surface that offered no cover against a Ukrainian military that had every incentive to make their lives miserable from the air and from the water. They managed for a while. And then the summer of 2025 happened. During a rotation handover, something broke inside the unit. The 337th had a violent confrontation with the Don Cossack Brigade soldiers they were supposed to be replacing. The details that have come out suggest a command-level dispute that escalated badly. Whatever the specifics, the Ukrainian military was watching, and what they saw was an elite unit that had stopped functioning as one. Moscow's response was to send Special Forces reinforcements in the spring of this year to stabilize the situation. That decision, meant to shore up a crumbling position, actually handed Ukraine the opening it had been waiting for. Here's why. The moment you inject a high-value reinforcement unit into an isolated peninsula with compromised logistics, you've made your supply problem worse. More soldiers, same broken supply lines. And now, if those supply lines get cut entirely, the problem isn't just acute, it's fatal to the position. Ukraine noticed. What happened next on the Kinburn Spit is a textbook case of what military planners call a logistical lockdown, but calling it a textbook case undersells how precisely it was executed. Ukraine didn't charge the peninsula. Instead, multiple branches of the Ukrainian military ran overlapping operations with a single shared goal: make the peninsula unreachable. The unmanned systems forces owned the air. Kamikaze drones flew constant patrol patterns over the supply routes feeding Kinburn. Russian air defense systems, designed to track and intercept larger threats, proved almost completely ineffective against small, fast, low-altitude drones flying in volume. The convoys stopped moving. The Navy's sea drone units controlled the waterways. Any attempt to resupply by sea got the same treatment the air routes were getting. The water around the Spit became a denial zone. Special operations forces from the HUR conducted infiltration operations from both land and sea, keeping Russian forces uncertain about their flanks and unable to predict where the next threat would appear. Partisans from the ATESH network provided targeting intelligence from inside Russian-held territory. This is the part of the operation that doesn't show up in official statements, but it matters enormously. Accurate intelligence means accurate strikes, which means no wasted drones on empty roads. Artillery from the Southern Operational Command provided fire support that kept Russian forces pinned while the supply operation was being dismantled around them. None of this is heroic in the traditional cinematic sense. There was no climactic assault. What there was a methodical, weeks-long process of cutting every thread that kept 300-plus Russian soldiers on that peninsula connected to the rest of their army. The ammunition ran out first, then the fuel, then the food. And then the soldiers started leaving. The withdrawal is still in progress, so let's be precise about what withdrawal means here. Russian forces have evacuated the northern and western coastal strips of the Kinburn Spit. They're moving east and south toward the interior of the peninsula and toward the mainland. The forward positions along the coast are now what analysts are calling a gray zone, territory neither side formally controls. This is not a rout. The Russian forces haven't been destroyed, but what the Kremlin is facing is something arguably worse than a battlefield defeat. A high-profile unit abandoning a strategic position under conditions that make it very hard to explain to anyone. You can spin a tactical retreat. You cannot easily spin "our soldiers left because they were hungry." The morale implications spread beyond Kinburn. Every other Russian unit on the southern front is watching. The implicit contract between command and soldier, that if you hold your position, you will be supplied, you will be supported, has been visibly broken. That kind of damage doesn't stay contained to one peninsula. But here's what actually changes the calculation for the entire theater: what Russia was doing with the Kinburn Spit beyond just occupying it. This position functioned as a major electronic warfare hub. The signal jamming operations covering Ochakiv and Mykolaiv were being run from the Spit. GPS spoofing that complicated Ukrainian drone operations in the region originated there. The Spit was the western anchor of the electronic shield Russia had built to protect Crimea's approaches. That shield is now gone from this end. For Ukraine, this matters in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Digital communications infrastructure in the region works better now. Drone operations that were being degraded by jamming become more reliable. And the western end of the defensive perimeter around Crimea has a gap in it that didn't exist a month ago. The question the Kremlin has to answer is how to fill that gap, and what it costs to try. Let's talk about what's happening in Crimea, because the Kinburn development doesn't exist in isolation. In recent days, Ukrainian drones struck a cargo train on the Jankoy to Kerch rail line in Crimea. The diesel locomotive was hit directly. The attack shut down railway traffic across the peninsula. That's not a minor disruption. The Jankoy station is the central logistics junction that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. Military supply moving south through the peninsula passes through this point. Ammunition, fuel, equipment, all of it routes through Jankoy. When that station stops working, the flow stops. There's no convenient bypass. Ukraine has also been systematically hunting road convoys on the highways approaching the front. The 422nd Unmanned Systems Regiment has run consistent operations against logistics vehicles, turning supply trucks into wreckage before they get close to their destinations. The reported range at which these interdictions are happening, well over 100 kilometers from the front line, means Russia has no deep rear anymore. There's no safe zone where supplies can stage and move forward. This is what the sensor-to-shooter cycle looks like in practice. A reconnaissance drone spots a convoy. Coordinates get transmitted in seconds to a strike element. The convoy gets hit before it can scatter. The whole sequence is faster than Russian logistics can adapt to. The kill chain is faster than the supply chain. And what happened on the Kinburn Spit was the downstream result of that cycle operating at scale. There's a phrase that military analysts use when a position becomes untenable through supply denial: dying on the vine. The garrison on Kinburn died on the vine, but the vine, the logistical network feeding the entire southern front, is still being systematically cut. Russia has limited options here. They can try to reinforce Kinburn, but they'd be sending troops into the same supply trap that broke the 337th Regiment. They can write off the position, which is probably what's happening, but that creates a physical gap in the Western Crimean approach that Ukraine can exploit. They can redeploy forces from other sections of the line to cover the gap, but every repositioning weakens somewhere else. There's no clean answer. That's the point of the strategy. The Kremlin recently made a decision that tells you something about their thinking. They diverted some soldiers from the Kinburn garrison to the Zaporizhzhia direction. Under pressure elsewhere, they raided a garrison that was already under pressure. The soldiers left behind were already exhausted. That order didn't solve a problem. It guaranteed the Kinburn position would eventually collapse. Let's bring this back to what the Mykolaiv port actually means, because the human stakes here are larger than the military picture. Mykolaiv is a working port in a country at war. Or it was. The Russian occupation of the Kinburn Spit put the port under direct artillery threat and shut down normal operations. For Ukraine's agricultural exports, grain, sunflower oil, other commodities, this closure created a bottleneck with effects that reached well beyond Ukraine's borders. Ukraine at full export capacity contributes meaningfully to global grain supply. Mykolaiv offline meant that supply moved through other routes, more expensively, in smaller volumes. With Russian forces pulling back from the Kinburn coast, the direct artillery threat to Mykolaiv begins to ease. The port doesn't reopen immediately. There's still active conflict in the region, but the trajectory has changed. A port that handles roughly a third of Ukraine's agricultural exports becoming safer to operate matters for Ukrainian government revenue, for global food prices, and for the economic sustainability of the war effort. This is what strategic geography looks like when you zoom out far enough. A strip of sand becomes a choke point on a trade corridor that feeds a global food supply chain. What happens next depends on how aggressively Ukraine pushes through the opening it's created. One scenario, Ukraine establishes a small bridgehead on the Kinburn Spit's gray zone. Even a limited foothold on that sandy terrain changes the tactical picture for the entire Kherson region east of the Dnipro. Russian positions on the eastern bank come under pressure from a direction they weren't expecting to defend. Crossing the river becomes a significantly different proposition for Ukrainian forces when the western bank of the Kherson approach is under their control. A second scenario. Ukraine chooses not to hold the Spit directly, but uses its unmanned naval capabilities to keep the waters around it under tight control, preventing Russia from reasserting any position there. The Navy's sea drones have already demonstrated they can deny Russia naval freedom of movement in the Black Sea. That capability extended to the Kinburn approaches creates a persistent denial zone without requiring Ukrainian soldiers to occupy exposed ground. Both scenarios lead to the same larger place. Russia's ability to supply and reinforce Crimea keeps degrading. The railway through Jankoy is already disrupted. The road convoys are being hunted. The electronic warfare hub on Kinburn is gone. The western end of the defensive perimeter has a gap. Crimea is not about to fall tomorrow, but the conditions that would make it defensible over the long term are eroding, piece by piece, in exactly the way Ukraine has designed this campaign. Step back and look at what's actually been proven here, across the entire Kinburn operation. Russia built a 3-year defensive presence on a strategic piece of coastline. They staffed it with a dedicated airborne regiment. When that regiment showed internal problems, they sent in Special Forces reinforcement. They had electronic warfare capabilities, artillery coverage, and a recognized strategic rationale for holding the position. None of it survived sustained logistical interdiction. The lesson isn't that Russia's forces are weak. The lesson is that modern drone networks can make territory unsupplyable at scale. And when territory is unsupplyable, territory becomes indefensible. It doesn't matter how good the soldiers are. It doesn't matter how layered the fixed defenses are. When the ammunition runs out and the food doesn't come, soldiers leave. That's not a moral judgment. That's physics. Ukraine has built a system capable of doing this over wide areas, at sustained operational tempo. The Kinburn Spit was one node in a much larger interdiction campaign. The Crimean rail network is another. The highway convoys are another. Each one, individually, is a news item. Together, they're a strategy. The old assumption about defending territory was that firepower wins. Hold the line, build the bunkers, concentrate the artillery, and you can hold ground indefinitely. What's happening in the South is testing whether that assumption survives in an environment where your supply lines can be cut faster than you can repair them, by systems too small and too numerous to reliably intercept. The emerging reality is that supply chain integrity might now be more determinative than frontline firepower. An army that can't eat, can't fuel its vehicles, and can't reload its weapons isn't an army that can hold positions, regardless of what those positions looked like on paper. The question that doesn't have a clean answer yet: where does this end? Russia still has deeply layered defenses across Crimea. They've concentrated significant air defense assets there precisely because they know it's a target. The peninsula doesn't become indefensible overnight, and the Russian military has shown it can adapt under pressure, even if slowly. But adaptation requires resources. Resources require supply routes. Supply routes require protection. And right now, Russia's ability to protect supply routes in the south is being outpaced by Ukraine's ability to disrupt them. The Kinburn spit wasn't the end of anything. It's one indicator in a longer trend line. The question is whether the trend line holds, whether Ukraine can sustain this interdiction campaign at the intensity required to keep degrading Russian logistics faster than Moscow can reinforce them. If it does, the southern front starts to look very different within months. Not because of any single dramatic operation, but because of the cumulative weight of 1,000 supply trucks that never arrived, a dozen trains that never ran, and one elite regiment that left a 3-year position without a fight because no one could get them a meal. That's what a logistical war looks like when one side is winning it. Who fixes their supply chain first, and whether the other side lets them, is probably the real question this war is now asking.